A chance encounter. The storm rolled in suddenly, catching everyone off guard. Dark clouds blanketed the sky, and cold rain pelted the city streets. In the chaos, a young man named Logan stepped out of his chauffeured car, his tailored coat shielding him from the worst of the downpour. At only 22, Logan was already accustomed to a life of luxury. As the sole heir to the Crawford fortune, he had everything a person could want: wealth, power, and a future laid out before him. But for all his privilege, Logan felt empty. Life had become a series of transactions, obligations, and shallow interactions. His father, Richard Crawford, a stern and calculating businessman, had raised him to focus on success above all else. The mansion they lived in was vast, filled with art and antiques, but devoid of warmth or laughter. Logan's musings were interrupted when his car slowed near a park bench. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw an elderly woman sitting there, clutching a thin shawl around her frail frame. Her silver hair was plastered to her head, and her clothes were soaked. Something about her posture, a mix of quiet dignity and vulnerability, struck Logan. Without hesitation, he instructed the driver to stop. "Sir," the driver asked, confused, "we're nearly home." "Just stop," Logan said firmly, opening the door before the car had fully halted. He stepped out, his leather shoes splashing in a growing puddle. The cold rain seeped into his clothes, but he didn't care. Approaching the woman, he noticed her shivering hands and the way she clutched a small, tarnished locket. "Ma'am," Logan said gently, crouching to her level, "you'll get sick out here. Do you have anywhere to go?" The woman looked up, her kind yet tired eyes meeting his. For a moment, she seemed startled, as if seeing something familiar in his face. But then her expression shifted, and she shook her head. "No, dear," she replied softly. "I don't." Logan hesitated. He knew his father would disapprove of what he was about to do, but he couldn't leave her out in this storm. "Come with me," he said, offering his hand. "I'll make sure you're safe tonight." The woman hesitated, her fingers brushing against the locket. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice wavering. "I don't want to be a burden." Logan smiled warmly. "You won't be. Please, let me help." After a brief pause, she took his hand. Her touch was cold, but there was a surprising strength in her grip. Logan led her to the car, shielding her as best as he could from the rain. The driver looked puzzled but said nothing as the pair climbed in. The ride back to the mansion was quiet. Logan noticed the woman's eyes darting around, taking in the luxurious interior of the car. When they reached the Crawford estate, her reaction was even more pronounced. The grand mansion loomed before them, its lights cutting through the storm like a beacon. Logan helped her out of the car and led her up the marble steps to the front door. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them, and the woman sighed in relief. The butler, Henry, appeared, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Sir," Henry began, eyeing the woman's drenched appearance, "shall I prepare a room for the guest?" "Yes," Logan replied firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And bring some dry clothes and tea." As Henry disappeared down the hall, the woman turned to Logan. "You're very kind," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Logan shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "It's nothing," he replied. "Just rest. You're safe here." But as the woman glanced around the opulent foyer, her eyes lingered on a large family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Her hand flew to her chest, gripping her locket tightly, and her breathing quickened. "What's wrong?" Logan asked, alarmed. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the portrait. "Nothing," she whispered, though her voice trembled. I think I've been here before." Logan frowned, puzzled by her words. But before he could press her further, Henry returned with towels and tea. The moment passed, leaving Logan with an unsettling feeling he couldn't quite place. Little did he know, this chance encounter was about to unravel a series of secrets that would change his life forever. A whisper from the past. The woman sat on the edge of the plush sofa in the drawing room, her frail hands cradling the steaming cup of tea Henry had prepared. The crackling fire in the hearth filled the room with a comforting warmth, but Logan noticed her eyes kept darting to the portrait above the mantel. Her expression was difficult to read, somewhere between curiosity and unease. Logan sat across from her, studying her in the flickering light. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. "You seem distracted." She hesitated, setting the cup down carefully on the ornate side table. Her hands moved to her lap, where she fiddled nervously with the locket. "It's just," she began, her voice trailing off. "That painting. There's something about it. I can't explain it." Logan followed her gaze to the family portrait. It depicted him as a young boy, standing stiffly beside his father and mother, who had passed away when Logan was barely 5. The image was a reminder of the life he'd lived before loss and isolation became familiar companions. "That's my family," Logan explained, his tone tinged with melancholy. "My parents, and me, my mother." He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "She's not with us anymore." The woman's eyes softened, and her hand moved instinctively to the locket around her neck. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I know how it feels to lose someone." Logan nodded, appreciating her empathy but still intrigued by her reaction to the portrait. "What is it about the painting?" he asked gently. "You said it feels familiar." She hesitated again, the locket now open in her trembling hands. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a baby boy. Logan leaned forward, curious. "Is that your family?" he asked, gesturing to the picture. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or at least I think it is. My memory isn't whole. There was an accident years ago, and I lost so much. Faces, places, even my own child." Her voice broke on the last word, and Logan felt his chest tighten. "Your child," he repeated, stunned. She nodded, tears brimming in her tired eyes. "A boy. He would be about your age now, I think. But I don't remember his face. Just this mark." She traced her finger over the photograph. A crescent-shaped birthmark on his wrist. Logan's breath caught. His mind raced as he tried to dismiss the sudden jolt of recognition. "It's a coincidence," he told himself. "It has to be." But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise. Clearing his throat, Logan leaned back, his tone casual despite the turmoil inside him. "That's quite a story," he said. "Do you remember anything else? About where you lived, or what happened before the accident?" She shook her head, closing the locket with a soft click. "Not much. Flashes, mostly. A hospital room, the sound of someone singing a lullaby, and this overwhelming sense of loss. I spent years trying to piece it all together, but it's like chasing shadows." Logan frowned, the unease in his chest growing stronger. He glanced at his wrist, the cuff of his shirt hiding the birthmark he'd had since birth. A crescent shape, faint but unmistakable. His father had always dismissed it as an oddity, never mentioning its significance. Before he could ask more, Henry entered the room. "Sir," the butler said, his voice respectful but firm, "your father wishes to see you in the study." Logan's stomach sank. He had nearly forgotten the storm his impulsive decision would likely unleash. Standing, he gave the woman a reassuring smile. "Stay here and rest. I'll handle this." She nodded, her gratitude evident in her eyes. "Thank you, Logan," she said softly. Hearing his name from her lips sent another jolt through him, but he pushed the feeling aside. With a final glance at the locket, he turned and followed Henry down the long corridor. In the study, Richard Crawford stood behind his massive oak desk, his imposing figure framed by the tall bookshelves lining the room. The storm outside had subsided, but the tension in the air was palpable. He turned as Logan entered, his piercing gaze locking onto his son. "What is the meaning of this, Logan?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp and cold. bringing a stranger into our home without consulting me. Do you have any idea how reckless that was?" Logan squared his shoulders, refusing to back down. "She had nowhere else to go, Dad. It was pouring. And she would have been out there all night. I couldn't just leave her." Richard's expression hardened. "And how do you know she's not some con artist, looking for a way to exploit us? People will do anything when they see an opportunity." "She's not like that," Logan argued, his voice rising. "She's different. I can feel it." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Feel it? That's not how the world works, Logan. Feelings don't protect you from being deceived." "Maybe not," Logan shot back. "But decency does. Maybe if you stopped treating everyone like a threat, you'd understand that." The room fell silent, the tension between father and son thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Richard exhaled, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "One night," he said curtly. "She can stay for one night. After that, she leaves." "Understood." Logan clenched his jaw, but nodded. "Fine." As Logan left the study, his thoughts were a whirlwind. The woman's words echoed in his mind, and the image of her locket lingered like a ghost. Something about her felt important, like a missing piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was solving. Later that night, Logan stood outside the woman's room, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Finally, he knocked softly. "Come in," her gentle voice called. He entered to find her sitting by the window, the locket once again in her hands. The rain had stopped, and moonlight streamed through the glass, casting a silver glow over the room. "Are you all right?" Logan asked, stepping closer. She smiled faintly. "I am, thanks to you. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "You don't have to," Logan replied quickly. He hesitated, then added, "But I do have one question. This birthmark you mentioned, your son's birthmark, what exactly did it look like?" Her eyes lit with a bittersweet warmth. "It was small," she said, gesturing to her wrist. "Right here, a crescent moon, like something drawn in the sky." Logan swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. Slowly, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing the faint but distinct crescent mark on his own wrist. The woman's breath caught, and she stared at it as if seeing a ghost. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tears welled in her eyes, and her hands flew to her mouth. "Logan, could it really be you?" Logan stared at her, his world tilting. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But deep down, something told him the truth was about to change everything. A fragile thread. The air in the mansion felt heavier the morning after the startling revelation. Logan woke early, his mind still spinning from the previous night. He had shown her the crescent-shaped birthmark on his wrist, the same mark she described on her lost son. The woman's reaction had been profound, her tears and trembling words filling the room with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Now, as Logan paced his room, he struggled to make sense of it all. Could she really be his mother? How could something like this have been hidden for so long? And what would his father do if he found out? A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door creaked open, and the woman, Miriam, stepped inside. She looked more rested this morning, her silver hair neatly combed, though her eyes still carried the weight of years of loss. She held something in her hand, a small bundle of papers that looked weathered and fragile. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said softly, stepping into the room. "But I thought we should talk." Logan gestured to the chair by his desk. "Of course. Come in." Miriam sat down carefully, holding the papers close to her chest. "I've been trying to piece together the fragments of my memory," she began, "and I thought these might help." She handed him the bundle. Logan unfolded the papers gently, realizing they were old hospital forms. Most of the text was faded, but certain details stood out. Her name, the date of her admission, 8 years ago, and a mention of severe head trauma. His eyes lingered on one particular line. Infant, male, crescent birthmark on right wrist. His breath caught. This is real," he murmured, staring at the document. "You really were looking for your son?" Miriam nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I never stopped. Even when I couldn't remember his face or his name, I knew I had lost him. And when I saw you—" Her voice broke, and she looked away, wiping her eyes. Logan set the papers down and knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "I don't know what this means yet," he said gently. "But I promise we'll figure it out." Across the hall. Meanwhile, Richard Crawford was already in his study, reviewing the investigator's latest report. His face was stony as he flipped through the pages, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. The hospital records, the description of the birthmark, the timing. It all pointed to one conclusion. But Richard wasn't ready to accept it. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "If this is true," he muttered to himself, "everything I've built, everything I've worked for, it could all fall apart." He remembered the day he brought Logan into his home. The boy had been quiet and withdrawn, but there was a spark of potential in him. Richard had raised him to be strong, to take over the Crawford legacy. He couldn't let some woman from the past disrupt all of that. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Henry, the butler. "Sir," he said, bowing slightly, "the private investigator is here to see you." "Send him in," Richard replied, steeling himself. The investigator, Frank Morris, entered the room with his usual calm professionalism. "Mr. Crawford," he greeted, setting a slim file on the desk. "I've gathered the final pieces of information you requested." Richard opened the file, his eyes scanning the pages. Birth certificates, hospital logs, and even a statement from a nurse who had been on duty the night Miriam disappeared. The evidence was overwhelming. "It's undeniable," Morris said quietly. "Miriam Davis is Logan's biological mother." Richard slammed the file shut, his jaw tightening. "And the boy? He was adopted legally. There's no way she can claim custody, correct?" "The adoption papers are airtight," Morris confirmed. "But if this becomes public knowledge, well, it could complicate things." Richard nodded, his mind already working on a plan. "She can stay for now," he said finally, "but I want to control how this plays out. Keep digging. I need to know everything about her." In the garden. Later that day, Logan and Miriam sat together in the garden, a peaceful escape from the mansion's tension. Autumn leaves blanketed the ground, and a cool breeze carried the scent of rain. Miriam seemed more at ease here, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of her locket. "You know," she said suddenly, "I used to love gardens like this. When I was younger, I'd spend hours tending to flowers. It's one of the few memories I have that feels complete." Logan smiled. "Maybe you'll remember more as time goes on." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Do you believe I could be your mother?" she asked, her voice trembling. Logan hesitated. He didn't want to give her false hope, but he couldn't deny the connection he felt. I think there's a lot we need to figure out," he said carefully, "but I can't ignore the signs. The birthmark, the timing, the way we met. It feels like fate." Miriam reached out and took his hand. "No matter what happens," she said, "I want you to know how grateful I am. For your kindness, for giving me a chance." An unexpected revelation. That evening, Richard called a family meeting in the library. The tension was palpable as Logan and Miriam entered, finding Richard standing by the fireplace with the investigator's file in hand. "I've reviewed the evidence," Richard began, his tone sharp, "and it seems there's no denying the truth. Miriam, you are Logan's biological mother." The room fell silent. Miriam's hand flew to her chest, her emotions a mixture of relief and disbelief. Logan stared at his father, unsure whether to feel anger or gratitude for his acknowledgement. "But let me make one thing clear," Richard continued, his gaze fixed on Miriam. "Logan is my son. I raised him. I provided for him. And I won't let you disrupt his life with your sudden reappearance. Disrupt his life. Miriam shot back, her voice rising for the first time. I didn't choose to lose him. I spent 8 years searching, praying, hoping for answers. And now that I've found him, you think I'd just walk away? Logan stood, placing himself between the two. Stop, he said firmly. This isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about the truth. And the truth is, we're all connected now, whether we like it or not. Richard glared at his son but said nothing. Miriam, her shoulders trembling, looked at Logan with tears in her eyes. You're right, she whispered. The truth is what matters. For the first time, Logan felt a glimmer of hope that they might find a way forward, together. Fractured foundations. The atmosphere in the Crawford mansion shifted after the revelation. The once predictable rhythm of daily life gave way to an undercurrent of tension. Richard Crawford had reluctantly accepted Miriam's identity, but made it clear that her presence was temporary. Miriam, however, was determined to reclaim the time she had lost with Logan. For Logan, the situation felt like navigating a minefield, caught between loyalty to the man who raised him and an undeniable pull toward the woman who claimed to be his mother. A storm brews. Richard sat in his study, sipping from a glass of whiskey as he stared at the documents spread across his desk. The investigators' findings were thorough, but they didn't answer the question gnawing at him. What now? His assistant, Henry, entered quietly. Sir, he said, hesitating slightly, may I speak freely? Richard nodded, gesturing for him to continue. Ms. Miriam seems genuine, Henry said carefully. She's not here for money or influence. She simply wants to be near the boy. Richard scoffed. And how long before she wants more? People always want more. Henry stood silently, his expression neutral. Finally, he said, sometimes, sir, people just want what they've lost. Richard waved him off, muttering under his breath. He didn't trust easily, especially not someone who had the potential to disrupt everything he had built. An uneasy alliance. Meanwhile, Logan and Miriam spent their days forging a fragile bond. In the mornings, Miriam joined him in the garden, sharing snippets of her fragmented memories as they worked together. Logan found himself cherishing these moments, even as doubts lingered in his mind. One afternoon, as they pruned the rose bushes, Logan broke the silence. Do you ever feel like you're chasing something you'll never fully catch? Miriam paused, her hands hovering over a delicate bloom. All the time, she admitted. But even if I never remember everything, being here with you, it feels like I found the most important piece. Logan smiled faintly. It's weird. I've always felt like something was missing, but I never knew what. Now with you here, it's like that gap doesn't feel as big. They shared a quiet moment, the weight of their unspoken fears hanging in the air. A secret meeting. That evening, Richard called Logan to the study. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Logan entered hesitantly, sensing that this wasn't a casual conversation. Sit, Richard said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. He poured a glass of water and slid it across the desk to Logan. I've been thinking about the situation, Richard began, his tone measured. You need to understand what's at stake here. This woman's arrival. It complicates everything. Logan frowned. Complicates what? She's my mother. She's a disruption, Richard snapped. To your life, your future, everything I've worked to give you. And what if she decides to challenge custody? Do you think the courts will care that I've raised you all these years? Logan's jaw tightened. You're making this about you. This isn't about control or reputation. It's about me, my life, my family. Richard leaned forward, his expression hard. Family. Do you know what family means, Logan? It means protecting what's yours. I brought you into this home. I gave you every opportunity. And now you're ready to throw it all away for someone you just met. Logan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm not throwing anything away, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. I'm trying to figure out who I am. Maybe you should try it sometime." Without waiting for a response, Logan stormed out, leaving Richard alone with his whiskey and his thoughts. Uncovering the past. The next morning, Logan found Miriam in the library, poring over old photo albums and journals she had discovered in one of the mansion's storage rooms. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Look at these," she said, motioning for him to join her. "I thought they might help jog my memory." Logan sat beside her, flipping through the yellowed pages. The albums were filled with images of his childhood, birthdays, holidays, and candid moments captured in faded Polaroids. Miriam's eyes lingered on one photo in particular, a picture of Logan as a baby, his wrist visible with the crescent-shaped birthmark. "You were such a beautiful child," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe I missed so much." Logan placed a hand on her shoulder. "We can't change the past," he said gently, "but we have now." As they continued flipping through the album, a folded piece of paper fell out. Miriam picked it up and unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. The words were faded but legible. "To whom it may concern. The child has been placed under my care as per the arrangements. I trust this matter will remain confidential." Miriam's hands shook as she read the letter. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Logan took the letter, his eyes narrowing as he read it. "It sounds like some kind of adoption agreement," he said, his stomach churning. "But why would he write it like this?" Miriam's gaze hardened. "Because he knew," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He knew who you were, and he kept it from both of us." Confrontation. That evening, Miriam confronted Richard in the dining room. Logan stood behind her, his presence lending her strength. "Did you know?" she demanded, holding up the letter. "Did you know who Logan was when you took him in?" Richard's face darkened. "You don't understand the situation," he said coldly. "I did what was best for him." "Best for him?" Miriam shot back, her voice rising. "You took him from me and let me wander for years, not knowing where my child was. I saved him." Richard roared, slamming his fist on the table. "You were gone. The hospital was ready to hand him over to the state. Do you know what kind of life he would have had if I hadn't intervened?" "That wasn't your decision to make," Miriam said, her voice trembling with anger. "You had no right." Logan stepped forward, his expression a mix of hurt and betrayal. "You lied to me," he said quietly. "All these years, you let me believe you didn't know anything about my past." Richard's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. "I did what I thought was right," he said, his voice heavy. "You can hate me if you want, but I did it for you." Logan shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. "You did it for control," he said, "not for me." Shadows of the heart. The Crawford mansion, once a symbol of prestige and wealth, now felt like a battleground. The walls that had stood firm for generations seemed to echo the voices raised within them. After the explosive confrontation, silence filled the house, but it was the kind of silence that felt alive, charged with tension, regret, and unanswered questions. Logan retreated to his room, shutting out the world. Miriam, shaken but resolute, sat by the fireplace in her guest room, staring into the flickering flames. Richard, meanwhile, remained in his study, nursing another glass of whiskey as the weight of his choices pressed down on him. A late-night revelation. Logan couldn't sleep. The events of the evening replayed in his mind, each revelation adding another layer of confusion and pain. He had always known his father to be controlling, but this felt like betrayal. His eyes fell on the letter Miriam had found. It lay on his desk, its edges frayed from years of being hidden. He picked it up, reading the words again, hoping they would make more sense the second time. But they didn't. If anything, they only deepened the mystery. Why had his father written it in such vague terms? What had really happened at the hospital that day? Unable to sit with his thoughts any longer, Logan left his room and made his way to Miriam's. He knocked softly, and her voice, tired but warm, called out, "Come in." She looked up as he entered, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. "Logan," she said, sitting up straighter. "What's wrong?" He held up the letter. "I can't stop thinking about this," he admitted, sitting down across from her. "If my father knew who I was, why wouldn't he just tell me? Why hide it all these years?" Miriam's expression softened, and she reached for his hand. "Fear," she said simply. "He was afraid of losing you." "But he didn't lose me," Logan said, his voice rising with frustration. "If he had told me, we could have. I don't know, figured this out together." Miriam sighed, her gaze dropping to the locket in her hand. "Sometimes people let their fears dictate their actions," she said. "It doesn't make it right, but it does make it human." Logan looked at her, his heart aching for the years she had spent searching, the years she had lost. "You're a lot kinder than I feel right now," he said. A small, sad smile crossed her face. "Kindness doesn't come easy when you've lost so much," she said. "But if I'd learned anything, it's that anger doesn't heal wounds. It only makes them deeper." Logan nodded, her words resonating with him. For the first time since the confrontation, he felt a glimmer of clarity. "Then let's find the truth," he said. "Together. The search for answers." The next morning, Logan approached Henry, the ever-loyal butler who had been with the Crawford family for decades. If anyone knew the truth, it would be him. "Henry," Logan began, cornering him in the hallway, "I need to ask you something." Henry hesitated, his usual calm demeanor giving way to a flicker of unease. "Of course, Master Logan. What is it?" Logan took a deep breath. "When my father brought me here, did he know who I was? Did he know about Miriam?" Henry's expression faltered, and for a moment, he looked older, wearier. "Your father has always had a way of knowing things," he said carefully, "but it's not my place to say more." Logan's frustration flared. "It is your place," he insisted. "I have a right to know." Henry sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Your father received a call from the hospital the day you were born," he admitted. They told him about a baby left behind after a tragic accident. The details matched a case he had been tracking, a young woman named Miriam Davis who had been involved in a severe car crash. "Why would he track her?" Logan asked, confused. She was an employee," Henry said reluctantly. "She worked in your father's charitable foundation, helping children in foster care. Your father admired her dedication, but he always kept his distance until the accident." Logan's heart pounded. "So he knew," he said, the words heavy with realization. "He knew everything." Henry nodded solemnly. "Yes, but he believed he was doing what was best for you." Logan stepped back, his mind racing. "Thank you," he said quietly before turning and walking away. Confronting the past, Logan found Miriam in the garden later that day. She was tending to the roses, her hands moving with a grace that belied the turmoil within her. When she saw him approach, she straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Logan," she said, her voice tentative. "What is it?" "I talked to Henry," he said without preamble. "He told me everything. About how my father knew who you were, about how you worked for him." Miriam's eyes widened, and she shook her head in disbelief. "I worked for Richard," she repeated. I don't remember that." Logan stepped closer, his expression earnest. "You helped run his foundation for foster kids. You were helping children like me." Tears filled Miriam's eyes, and she covered her mouth with her hand. I remember wanting to help," she said, "but I never thought." She trailed off, her gaze distant. "You were doing good work," Logan said, "and he took you away from it." Miriam shook her head, her voice trembling. "No, Logan, he didn't just take me away from my work. He took me away from you. A father's defense." That evening, Logan confronted Richard once again, this time armed with the truth. He stormed into the study, slamming the door behind him. "You knew," he said, his voice trembling with anger. You knew who Miriam was. You knew who I was. And you lied to both of us." Richard looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "I did what I thought was right," he said. "No," Logan shot back. "You did what was easiest for you. You took her son. You took me." Richard stood, his calm facade finally cracking. "Do you think it was easy, Logan? Watching that woman suffer, knowing she might never recover. I gave you a life she couldn't. I gave you opportunities. And this is how you repay me." "This isn't about repayment," Logan said, his voice breaking. "It's about family. It's about truth." Richard stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tight. Finally, he said, "If you want to be with her, fine, but don't expect me to stand by and watch as you throw everything away." Logan shook his head, his heart heavy. "I'm not throwing anything away," he said. "I'm finally finding what I've been missing. The bridge between two worlds." The Crawford mansion seemed quieter than usual, as though the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The tension between Richard, Logan, and Miriam had reached a breaking point, but the question of what came after still hung in the air. Each of them grappled with their own emotions, their own fears, and their own hopes. For Logan, it was a time of discovery. For Miriam, it was a chance to reclaim what she had lost. And for Richard, it was a desperate attempt to hold on to the life he had carefully constructed. Miriam's resolve. Miriam sat at the edge of her bed, the faded locket resting in her palm. It had become a constant companion, a tether to the fragments of her past that had slowly begun to piece themselves together since she entered this house. She remembered the day she had been handed the locket, the way her hands had trembled as she clasped it around her neck. It had been a gift from her late mother, a reminder to hold on to what mattered most: family. But family, she thought bitterly, had been taken from her. Now, sitting in the mansion that had been her son's home for years, she felt both gratitude and anger. Gratitude for the kindness Logan had shown her, for the connection she now shared with him. Anger for the man who had kept them apart. Her fingers tightened around the locket as she stood. There was no more time for passive reflection. It was time to confront the truth head-on. Richard's struggle. Richard Crawford stared at the whiskey glass on his desk, its amber liquid reflecting the faint glow of the desk lamp. He hadn't touched it, though his hand hovered over it more than once. For all his confidence, Richard felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: vulnerability. He had made a decision 8 years ago, a decision he believed was right. He had convinced himself that Miriam, lost in the aftermath of the accident, would never recover. He had stepped in, providing Logan with what he considered stability, structure, and opportunity. But now, as the truth unraveled, he couldn't shake the gnawing doubt that he had acted selfishly. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice steadier than he felt. Miriam entered, her posture straight and her eyes unwavering. She carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had endured much and survived. "We need to talk," she said, her tone firm. Richard gestured to the chair across from him, but Miriam remained standing. "You don't have to like me, Richard," she began, "and I'm not asking for your permission. But I am asking for one thing: the truth." Richard's jaw tightened, his hand finally reaching for the whiskey. He took a slow sip before setting the glass down. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything," Miriam replied. "Why did you take him? Why didn't you try to find me? Why didn't you tell them?" Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't take him," he said. "I saved him. The hospital was ready to hand him over to the state. They told me you might never recover, and even if you did, there was no guarantee you'd be fit to care for a child. You made that decision for me." Miriam's voice cracked, anger and pain mingling in her tone. "You decided what was best for my son without even trying to contact me." "I thought I was doing the right thing," Richard snapped, his own voice rising. "I thought I was protecting him." "Protecting him from me," Miriam shot back. or protecting your perfect little life. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard said, "I'm not proud of what I did, but I can't change the past." Miriam took a deep breath, steadying herself. "No, you can't, but you can help fix the future." Logan's discovery. While Miriam and Richard clashed in the study, Logan was in the attic, a space he had rarely explored. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten memories, filled with dusty boxes, old trunks, and long-forgotten belongings. He wasn't sure what had drawn him there, but something told him the answers he sought might be hidden among the clutter. After an hour of searching, he found a box labeled Miriam. His heart pounded as he opened it, revealing a collection of items that seemed to belong to her. Photos of her with children at the foundation, handwritten letters, and a journal. Logan flipped through the journal, his breath catching at the words written in neat, looping handwriting. "I feel like something is missing. Like part of my heart has been taken, and I can't remember where it went. Every time I look at the children I work with, I wonder if they feel the same emptiness." The entries continued, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Logan's hands trembled as he read her words, the pain and longing she had endured evident on every page. And then he saw it, a photo tucked between the pages. It was an image of a younger Miriam holding a baby boy, her face glowing with love. His tiny wrist bore the crescent-shaped birthmark. Tears blurred Logan's vision as he stared at the photo. There was no denying it. This was his mother. She had loved him from the start. Bridging the divide. That evening, Logan brought the photo and the journal to the dining room, where Miriam and Richard were seated on opposite ends of the long table. The tension between them was palpable, but Logan was determined to cut through it. "I found this," he said, placing the photo on the table. Miriam's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she picked up the photo. Richard, too, leaned forward, his face pale. "This isn't about blame anymore," Logan said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his chest. "It's about what happens next. We can't change the past, but we can decide how to move forward." Miriam looked at Logan, her voice trembling. "What do you want, Logan?" "I want both of you in my life," he said simply. "I want to know my mother, and I want to keep the man who raised me. But that can only happen if we stop fighting and start figuring out how to make this work." Richard looked at Logan, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, "but I'll try." Miriam reached across the table, her hand brushing against Richard's. "So will I," she said softly. For the first time in years, the Crawford mansion felt like it might become a home, not just a house filled with secrets and tension, but a place where healing could begin. Rebuilding bridges. The atmosphere in the dining room, though tentative, felt like the first step toward healing. Logan's heartfelt plea had forced Miriam and Richard to reconsider their positions. Both of them, for their own reasons, realized that their shared love for Logan might be the only thing strong enough to bridge the gap between them. A plan for the future. Miriam sat quietly, the photograph still in her trembling hands. She traced the edges of the image, her thumb brushing over her younger self's face. For years, she had clung to a faint hope, and now, sitting here with Logan beside her, that hope felt tangible. "Logan," she said softly, turning to him, "I want you to know that I never stopped searching for you. Even when I couldn't remember much, I knew I had lost someone important. And now that I found you, I won't let you go." Logan placed his hand over hers, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I won't let you go either." Richard, sitting across the table, watched the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and reflection. His instinct had always been to protect Logan, but now he realized his version of protection might have caused more harm than good. He cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Miriam," he began, his voice careful, "I know words can't undo the years you lost, but I want to make things right. I don't know how yet, but I'm willing to try." Miriam studied him for a long moment, her gaze softening. We all made choices we thought were right at the time, she said. But if we want to move forward, we have to be honest. With each other and with Logan. Richard nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. Agreed. Opening the doors to the past. The following day, Miriam and Logan ventured into the attic together. Logan wanted to show her the box of belongings he had discovered, hoping it might jog more of her memories. Miriam looked around the space with wide eyes, her hands brushing against the dust-covered items, as though they were artifacts from another life. "This feels familiar," she murmured, pausing by an old rocking chair. "I used to sit in one just like this, singing lullabies." Logan smiled. "You hummed one the first night you stayed here. It felt familiar to me too." Miriam turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. "You remember the song?" He nodded. "Not the words, but the melody. It's like it's been in the back of my mind all these years." Miriam sat in the rocking chair, her hands clasped in her lap. Slowly, she began to hum the tune. Logan stood still, letting the soft melody wash over him. It felt like a key unlocking the door he hadn't realized was there. "Do you think?" Miriam hesitated. "Do you think we can make new memories to go with this song?" Logan's heart swelled. "I think we already are." A moment of reflection. Richard stood on the balcony of his study, watching the garden below. He saw Miriam and Logan walking together, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, not since Logan's mother had passed. For a long time, Richard had been the center of Logan's world, the provider, the protector. But now, watching the bond grow between Logan and Miriam, he felt an unfamiliar pang of vulnerability. Would he still have a place in Logan's life now that Miriam was here? Henry appeared behind him, breaking his thoughts. "Sir," the butler said, his tone gentle, "if I may offer some advice." Richard turned, raising an eyebrow. "Go on." "Families aren't built on control," Henry said. "They're built on trust and love. If you want to remain a part of Logan's life, you'll need to let go of the reins." Richard frowned but didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, "It's not that simple, Henry." "Perhaps not," Henry replied. "But nothing worth having ever is." The dinner table. That evening, Richard made a gesture that surprised both Miriam and Logan. He invited them to dinner in the formal dining room. The table was set with the finest china, the crystal glasses sparkling under the chandelier's light. "This feels intimidating," Miriam said as she took her seat. "It's just dinner," Richard said, though the stiffness in his tone betrayed his nerves. Logan smiled, trying to ease the tension. "Maybe we could start with something simple," he suggested, "like sharing a memory." Miriam looked thoughtful. "I remember when I was pregnant with you," she said, her gaze turning soft. "I used to imagine what you'd look like, what kind of person you'd become. I always knew you'd be special." Logan grinned. "I don't know about special, but I'm glad I got my sense of humor from you." Richard cleared his throat. "Logan," he began, "do you remember your first day at school?" Logan nodded. "Yeah. You were so nervous, Dad. You sat outside in the car for half an hour after dropping me off." Miriam chuckled, and Richard allowed himself a small smile. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." For the first time in years, the dinner table felt less like a battleground and more like a place where connections could grow. Building a new foundation. Over the next few weeks, the Crawford mansion began to change. Miriam and Logan spent more time together, sharing stories and creating new memories. Richard, though still reserved, began to soften, joining them in the garden or at the dinner table. One afternoon, Logan approached Richard in the study. "Dad," he said, his tone serious, "I want you to know that you're still my family. That won't change." Richard looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You've always been my son," he said, "and I'll always be here for you." Logan nodded. "I know, but maybe now we can all be a family." Richard didn't respond immediately, but his small, almost imperceptible smile spoke volumes. A family reunited. The Crawford mansion, once a fortress of control and isolation, now felt alive in ways it hadn't for years. The air was lighter, filled with laughter, conversation, and the hum of life that had been absent for so long. Logan, Miriam, and Richard had spent weeks navigating the delicate dance of rediscovery, and while there were still hurdles to overcome, the foundation of trust and love they were building was undeniable. An invitation. One crisp morning, Logan found Miriam in the garden. She was kneeling by the flower beds, her hands gently patting soil around the base of a blooming rosebush. The early sunlight made her silver hair shimmer, and Logan couldn't help but smile at the peaceful scene. "You've really made this place your own," he said, walking over to join her. Miriam looked up, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's therapeutic," she admitted. "Gardens remind me that even after the harshest winters, things can bloom again." Logan crouched beside her. "Speaking of new beginnings," he began, "I've been thinking about something." Miriam tilted her head, curious. "What's that?" "I want to throw a family dinner," Logan said. "Something informal. Just us. Maybe Henry and the staff too. A chance to celebrate everything we found." Miriam's eyes glistened with emotion. "That sounds wonderful," she said softly. "But do you think your father will agree?" Logan smiled. "He'll agree. Trust me." Richard's reluctance. Later that day, Logan approached Richard in his study. His father was reviewing contracts. His usual stern demeanor softened slightly in recent weeks. Logan leaned against the desk, waiting for Richard to look up. "What is it?" Richard asked, glancing at his son over his reading glasses. "I want to host a family dinner," Logan said. "Something simple, nothing fancy. Just us, and maybe the staff." Richard frowned. "Why?" "To celebrate," Logan replied. "We've come a long way, Dad. It feels like the right time to acknowledge that." Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "You think a dinner will solve everything?" "No," Logan admitted, "but it's a start. And honestly, we could all use a reason to smile." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine," he said finally, "but don't expect me to give a toast." Logan grinned. "Noted. A night to remember." The night of the dinner arrived, and the mansion was transformed into a warm, welcoming space. Candles lined the dining table, and the air was filled with the aroma of Henry's carefully prepared meal. For the first time, the usually formal dining room felt intimate and inviting. Miriam arrived first, wearing a simple but elegant dress. She had braided her silver hair, and a hint of nervousness showed in her eyes as she took in the scene. Logan met her at the door, offering a reassuring smile. "You look beautiful," he said. "Thank you, Logan," she replied, squeezing his hand. "This means so much to me." Richard entered moments later, dressed impeccably as always. He paused in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. When his gaze landed on Miriam, his expression softened. "You look nice," he said gruffly. Miriam smiled. "So do you." As everyone took their seats, Logan raised his glass. "Before we eat," he said, "I just want to say something. This past month has been unexpected, to say the least. But it's also been one of the most meaningful times in my life. We've faced some hard truths, but we've also found each other. And I think that's worth celebrating." Miriam and Richard exchanged a glance, their mutual respect evident despite the lingering tension. They both raised their glasses, echoing Logan's sentiment. "To family," Logan said. "To family," they repeated. A shared memory. After dinner, the three of them moved to the sitting room, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Miriam pulled out the photo album Logan had found in the attic, and they began flipping through the pages together. Richard hesitated at first, but eventually he leaned in, pointing to a photo of a younger Logan. "That was the day you got into trouble for climbing the fence at school," he said, a rare smile playing at his lips. Logan laughed. "I was trying to impress the kids in my class. didn't exactly go as planned. Miriam listened intently, her heart swelling with gratitude for the glimpses of her son's childhood she had missed. She turned the page and paused at a photo of Richard and Logan standing by a Christmas tree. "You did give him a good life," she said softly, looking at Richard. "I can see that now." Richard's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no animosity in his gaze. "I tried," he said simply, "but I made mistakes. Big ones." "We all did," Miriam said. "But we're here now. And that's what matters." A final gesture. As the evening wound down, Logan pulled out a small box from his pocket. "I have something for both of you," he said, his voice laced with excitement. He handed the box to Miriam first. Inside was a gold chain with a tiny charm shaped like a crescent moon. Miriam's eyes filled with tears as she held it up. "Logan," she whispered, "it's beautiful." Logan smiled, then turned to Richard, handing him a similar box. Inside was a charm shaped like the sun. "For you," Logan said, "because you've always been the steady light in my life." Richard cleared his throat, visibly moved. "Thank you, son," he said gruffly. Logan stood, looking at both of them. "You've both given me so much," he said, "and now it's my turn to give back. I want us to move forward, not as separate pieces, but as a family." Miriam and Richard exchanged a glance, and for the first time, they both smiled. The beginning of forever. As the fire crackled and laughter filled the room, the three of them sat together, sharing stories and creating new memories. The past had been painful, but the future felt hopeful, a future where love, understanding, and forgiveness could bridge even the deepest divides. The Crawford mansion was no longer just a house. It was a home. The ties that bind. The night stretched on, the warmth of the fire mirrored in the hearts of those gathered in the sitting room. Logan, Miriam, and Richard shared more than memories. They shared laughter, a rare commodity in the Crawford mansion for far too long. The shadows of their past had begun to fade, replaced by the light of understanding and hope. A walk in the garden. The next morning, Logan found Miriam in the garden, her favorite place in the mansion. She was tending to the roses again, her hands moving with practiced ease. The garden had become her sanctuary, a place where she felt both grounded and free. "Good morning," Logan said, stepping onto the cobblestone path. Miriam looked up, her face lighting up with a smile. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" Logan nodded. "Better than I have in a long time. I think last night it changed something." Miriam straightened, brushing the dirt from her hands. "It did," she agreed. "But change is a process, not a moment. We'll still have challenges ahead." Logan reached for her hand. "As long as we face them together, I think we'll be okay." Miriam squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. "I never thought I'd get this chance," she said softly. "To be with you, to watch you grow into the incredible person you are. It's more than I could have hoped for." Logan grinned. "Well, you're stuck with me now." Richard's gesture. Later that day, Richard called Miriam and Logan to his study. The air was tense, but there was a new softness in Richard's demeanor. On the desk sat a stack of papers, neatly arranged. "Sit," Richard said, gesturing to the chairs in front of him. Logan and Miriam exchanged a glance before taking their seats. Richard leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, "and I've realized that holding on to control won't bring me peace, so I've decided to make some changes." He pushed the papers toward Miriam. "This is the paperwork to officially add you to Logan's guardianship." Miriam's eyes widened. "Richard, I don't." "Let me finish," Richard said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're his mother, Miriam. You always have been. I can't undo the years you lost, but I can give you this." Miriam's hands trembled as she picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the legal jargon. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll accept it," Richard said, "for Logan's sake." Logan looked at his father, his throat tight with emotion. "Dad," he said, his voice barely audible. "Thank you." Richard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion in the room. "I'm not perfect, Logan," he said, "but I'm trying. For you." A new chapter. The following weeks were a flurry of activity as Miriam settled into her new role. The mansion, once a symbol of rigid control, became a place of love and growth. Logan split his time between bonding with Miriam and continuing to learn from Richard, who had softened considerably in his approach. One afternoon, Logan found Richard in the study, going through old photographs. "Dad," Logan said, sitting across from him, "do you ever regret taking me in?" Richard looked up, startled by the question. "Never," he said firmly. "You've been the best decision I've ever made, Logan." Logan smiled. "And now we get to share that with her. It's like all the pieces are finally coming together." Richard nodded. "It's strange, isn't it? How life works out. A family united." On a crisp autumn evening, the three of them gathered in the garden, the stars twinkling above. Miriam had prepared hot cocoa, and they sat together, wrapped in blankets, sharing stories and dreams. "This feels right," Logan said, looking at his parents. "Like this is how it was always meant to be." Miriam leaned her head on his shoulder. "It took us a long time to get here, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Richard raised his mug in a rare show of celebration. "To family," he said. "To family," Miriam and Logan echoed. As they sat beneath the vast night sky, the Crawford family, fractured for so long, felt whole at last. The past had been painful, but it had shaped them, brought them together. And now they looked to the future, not as individuals, but as a family.